Hey, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is, students. Welcome back to Mr. Lawhon's AP European History Notes. Today we're going to begin Chapter 8. If you remember, we did the chapters a little bit out of order. The previous chapter was Chapter 9, and it was about the Enlightenment. And why I did it this way, it's because the Enlightenment is going to lay a lot of foundations for what happens in this chapter, so I always like to talk about this chapter first. And this chapter is called The Transatlantic Economy, Trade Wars, and Colonial Rebellion. Now, maybe that's not the best chapter or the best title for this chapter, but I guarantee this is going to be an interesting chapter, and a lot of the things that we're going to talk about are things that are very much talked about in history as far as the American Revolution and legendary things like that. That's all going to happen in this chapter. So pause if you need to, and let's dive into our introduction. When we left off, like I said, we were talking about the Enlightenment, but let's go way back before that. Have you noticed in the last couple chapters, hasn't really been a lot of talk of wars and things like that? Well, it's not that wars hadn't been going on or battles hadn't broken out here or there, but if you really think about it, we really haven't talked about a lot of major world wars since the Reformation and the era of religious wars in the 1500s. The biggest one was the 30 Years' War that we talked about that happened in the mid 1500s. So there hadn't really been a lot of European wars since the Reformation. They kind of died down. Well, in this chapter, you're about ready to see those wars pick right back up again and become world wars. Since Columbus, way back in chapter 1, the 15th century, Europeans had gained overseas territories and colonies. And what we're going to see in today's notes is we are going to see these overseas colonies and kind of what they encompassed and what were the characteristics of these colonies. Another thing we're going to see, the last chapter was about the Enlightenment, and as the ideas of the Enlightenment, people like John Locke and the ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and if a government ever takes away these rights, then you should overthrow those governments. And people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his social contract, and Adam Smith's idea of laissez-faire, all of these ideas in the Enlightenment are going to increasingly cause Europeans to question a couple things. Number one, question their economic systems that they live under. But number two, question their government. Is absolutism the best form of doing things? Are things like constitutional governments and republics a little bit better? Well, you're going to see they're going to try those things in this chapter. And specifically when we get to the American Revolution, the Americans are going to build a government based on the Enlightenment ideals. Another thing that we're going to see is that the Enlightenment ideas, combined with a lot of arguments over territories and colonies, are going to lead to trade wars, disputes, fights, battles, naval battles, all kinds of fighting in the 1700s, which is the 18th century. And that's another thing that's going to happen in this chapter, are trade wars. I mean, if you think about it, that's kind of what the American Revolution was, a trade war. But there's going to be other trade wars that are going to break out, and maybe the biggest war, I know we think the American Revolution's a big one, but maybe even bigger than that, is going to be what's called the 7 Years' War. We'll talk about that in this chapter too. So all of these wars are going to be costly. They're going to be not only physically costly in human lives, but expensive, like monetarily costly. And they're going to lead to a new balance of power in Europe. As a matter of fact, a lot of the wars and a lot of the trade disputes that we're going to talk about in this chapter are going to directly lead to the big one in the next chapter, the French Revolution. So pause if you need to, and let's dive into our first essential question, which I just realized I did not make a slide for the first essential question. So I guess we're going to call it this, guys. Essential question 8.1. What were the characteristics of mercantile empires? All right, so let's go back over that. Essential question 8.1. What were the characteristics of mercantile empires? Now you might be like, Lahan, what is a mercantile empire? Well, pause if you need to, and we'll dive into what that means. All right, but before we do that, we're going to talk about just what an empire is. I kind of asked you guys this in class, and nobody really raised their hand to answer or talk about it, and that's because nobody really ever raises their hands or even talks to me in class, which is why I cry myself to sleep at night on my pillow every evening. I'm just kidding, I don't really do that. But anyway, so I asked you guys, what is an empire? And some of you guys kind of had some vague ideas of empires, but I mean, if you think about Star Wars, all right, I mean that's what people think about usually when they think of the Empire. The Empire, guys, where people like Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine had control of every planet in the galaxy. That's an empire. You conquer every planet in the galaxy, and all the resources and all the goods in the galaxy are controlled by you. All the wealth of the galaxy comes to you. Well, guys, that's what an empire is. One group of people controlling an entire vast area. And we learned about the beginning of Christopher Columbus way back early in chapter 1 or 2. I can't remember what chapter it was. I think it was chapter 2. We learned about Columbus and how he began the Spanish Empire in the Americas. So if you look at the periods of what we are going to call imperialism, the history book that you have talks about 4 stages of imperialism, and I'm going to stick with that because it kind of makes sense. And what I'm going to teach you about right now are these 4 stages. Now, the first 2 stages we have talked about and we are going to talk about, and the last 2 stages we're going to reach later on in another chapter, okay? So let's talk about these stages of imperialism. Now, stage 1 of stages of European conquest actually happened in the 15th and 16th centuries, 1400s and 1500s, and this is the time period of Christopher Columbus. So think about Spain sending Columbus to sail west way back in chapter 2, and remember he landed in, look on the map right there, Hispaniola, what we would call modern day basically Haiti. That's where he landed. And he thought he landed in the Indies, which is, the East Indies over by India, Indonesia, places like that. But he actually landed, guys, in the Gulf, well, close to the Gulf of Mexico in the Atlantic Ocean. And that's what they're going to call themselves, the West Indies. Okay? All right, so this was the period of European discovery. Think about it. Columbus discovered America. And by discovered America, guys, I don't mean literally. How can you discover something with millions of people already living on it? But to Europeans who didn't know Americans existed or the Americas existed, that was quite the discovery. It's also the era of exploration. Now, we didn't really dive into it very much in this class, but definitely in a U.S. history class, you would talk about it a lot more. But a lot of the conquistadores, such as Francisco Pizarro and Hernan Cortez, they are going to explore places like Mexico and Central America and South America, and other explorers are going to explore North America. This was that time period, and they're going to conquer. We talked about Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs in Mexico, but they're going to conquer and they're going to settle the new world. They're going to create what are called colonies. What's a colony? It's basically like a home base in a new area. So the Spanish come over, they conquer Mexico and South America and Central America, and you can see they call it New Spain. That is their colony. Okay? Now, if you really want to dive into it, Portugal, the very first imperial power, and the Dutch, they were also creating outposts in Asia. As a matter of fact, guys, by the 1530s, the Portuguese had spread as far as Japan. But anyway, most of the focus of the stage 1 of European conquest was North America, Central America, and South America. All right? This is stage 1, and it starts with Columbus. Now, stage 2 is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. It's going to be these mercantile empires, all right? So it is the era of mercantilism, and that's a vocab word, and we're very quickly going to talk just briefly about, we're going to define mercantilism, and then later on in the notes today, we're really going to dive into what mercantilism is. So mercantilism is just basically, if I had to define it, and this is kind of my definition, it's a trade system where colonies exist to supply a mother country with raw materials and resources. Now, there's more to it than that, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but let me kind of break down what I mean here. Basically, a mother country, like Great Britain, sets up colonies, like the American colonies, the 13 colonies of America. And the goal of the mother country is to use those 13 colonies to settle it with English people. And the idea is those English people are going to grow crops. They're going to cut down trees. They're going to mine natural resources and send them over to the mother country. Now, in this system, the greatest beneficiary, the person that benefits the most, is the mother country. And we're going to talk about that more in another slide. But bottom line is just understand mercantilism is where the goal is a powerful European nation is going to set up colonies and exploit the resources of those colonies. Okay? That's mercantilism. Now, another goal of mercantilism that we're going to talk about later on down the road is you want to export more than you import. Now, like I said, guys, in a little bit, we're going to talk about a slide, guys, where I talk about what that means. But essentially, you want to sell more things than you buy. It's a typical budget. If you've ever budgeted your money, which most of you guys probably haven't because you're sophomores, but if you ever budget your money, as a teacher, I make a certain amount of money every month, right? And my goal is to make more money than I spend. And that's what export more than you import means. We'll talk about that a little bit more down the road. Now, another characteristic of stage 2, and basically all stages of colonialism, not just stage 2, is warfare with indigenous people. You're going to see a lot of fights break out in this stage. And you saw a little bit of it in stage 1, like the Aztecs fighting back against Europeans. But these early stages, you're going to see, I'm not going to lie, guys, every stage of empire has warfare with indigenous people. Now, indigenous people are the people that were there first. For instance, Europeans such as Hernan Cortez, Spanish, go into Mexico, what we call present-day Mexico, and they see the Aztecs are there. Well, they kind of get along for a little bit, but the Aztecs find out that the Europeans are going to try to conquer them and take their wealth. So what happens? The Aztecs fight back. That is a sign of imperialism, warfare with indigenous people. And by warfare, I usually mean kind of massacres because Europeans have technology and weapons that the indigenous people often don't have. So oftentimes we use the words warfare, but it's really, in many cases, a massacre. And that is another characteristic of these overseas empires. Pause if you need to, and we'll move on to the next slide. Oh yeah, backtrack. Also involve large naval wars. Navies from Great Britain are going to fight against navies from France. What are they fighting over? Territory. I mean, look at the map of North America. The purple is France. The red is Great Britain. The kind of beigeish yellow is Spain. Tell me these guys aren't going to fight each other over territory, but most of it happens in the Atlantic Ocean. Why? Because that's where Spain and France and England have their navies. So another kind of, especially stage 2, another characteristic of stage 2 is warfare in the Atlantic Ocean. Naval wars, the wars between ships. Now, pause if you need to. Another common characteristic of stage 1 and stage 2 European colonialism in this time period is African slavery. Now, if you were in class today, we talked about the Middle Passage. I'll talk about it a little bit more just in case you weren't in class. But we talked about the horrors of African slavery. And like I said, it was a very common feature. As a matter of fact, it was a staple of the early stages of European colonialism. Slavery, African slavery specifically. Now, if you get into my African American history class next year, we'll spend the first 2 months just talking about pretty much this. But essentially, if I was going to break it down for European history class, I would say, just like the notes say, African people, backtrack. African kingdoms had an established system of slavery. Remember from chapter 2, we talked about how slavery is as old as humans. Every continent on this planet has practiced slavery. But if you fast forward to the 1400s, Africa had a huge network of slaves. It was kind of a leftover from the different periods of African kingdoms, a leftover from the Muslim empires, but they traded slaves all over Africa and all over Europe and all over the Middle East. Well, the Portuguese, when they came to Africa in about 1450, they started to buy slaves from these African kingdoms. And what that caused was an explosion in the sale of slaves. Europeans' lust for free labor went crazy in this time period. And what happened was their demand for slaves became so great that basically here come the French, here come the English, here comes everybody buying slaves from these African kingdoms. And what that caused was warfare between these African kingdoms to find more slaves to meet the demand. And what we saw was Africa basically getting almost depopulated. As a matter of fact, not almost depopulated, but absolutely depopulated. So if you can imagine African people ripped from their homes, sold in humiliating, deadly auctions. and shipped across the Atlantic on a dangerous voyage called the Middle Passage, right? So you can see here is a map of slave trade in Europe in what we would call probably the 1600s and 1700s. And you can see the majority of slaves are coming from that west coast of Africa. At least that's where they're being sold. A lot of slaves are coming from the interior of Africa. But anyway, like I told you in class, entire villages of Africa, guys, were wiped out and sold to Europeans for the Middle Passage. All right. Now, what is the Middle Passage, guys? Well, the Middle Passage is the trip that African people were forced on. Once they were sold to the coasts, they would be sold to Europeans. They would be forced on these ships, crammed together in the horrible situations, the most horrific scenes you can think of. We read about them in class of people on these ships. The ships were overcrowded. Human beings were chained together. They were sitting and lying in their own human waste. Disease like the white flux and smallpox wreaked havoc aboard these ships. Conditions were so bad that some African slaves were trying to jump off ship and commit suicide rather than be a slave. So the suffering and the death and the destruction of human life on these ships is unimaginable. All right. And they died on this passage. A lot of them never even made it to the Americas, where they would be then again sold into slavery to work on a plantation. Here's a diagram that I showed you guys in our primary source assignment, where you just saw the amount of human beings crammed onto a ship. Now, in the New World, African people were forced to work largely on plantations. That was the big moneymaker. All European nations like Spain and France and Great Britain, they all had these vast plantation economies where they would grow sugar, or they would grow tobacco in the Americas, or they would grow later on in the 1800s. Cotton is going to be the big item that are going to be grown on plantations. But the idea was they would grow these huge amount of cash crops and make their countries wealthy beyond imagination. So African slavery, guys, is a staple of European imperialism. European powers could not have grown in the wealth and power that they did without depending on free labor, all right, of human beings, okay? So, guys, African slavery is what is going to build up these European empires, including, and I say European empires, guys, including the Americas, because at this point, the British colonies in America are absolutely engaging in slavery, and they eventually are going to break away and form the United States, and slavery is going to continue until 1865. But once again, it is African people, African slaves that are being forced to work and build up the economies of these European and American nations. So that is a staple, guys, of imperialism in stage 1 and stage 2. Pause if you need to. All right, now, it will be during stage 2 of the conquest that we're going to talk about colonial rebellion. Now, one of the big early rebellions is going to be the American Revolution, but also the Mexican Revolution, where Mexico is going to break away from Spain. So, the American Revolution and Mexico, colonies of these European nations, are going to gain independence during the second stage of conquest. All right, now let's move into stage 3. We're not going to talk about it very much because that's later on down the road as this class gets through, probably about early February, around in that area. In later chapters, we're going to see imperialism shift from the Americas to Asia and Africa. It's a period called the New Imperialism. And if you think European colonies were greedy in the Americas, look at this map, guys, of what's going to happen in the 1800s. Pretty much all of Africa, except 2 areas, are going to be colonized by Europeans. Every color you see on that map is an area that was conquered by Europe. Most of Africa, lots of Asia. All right, all of these are going to be European colonies. And that's going to be the 19th century, the 1800s. That's going to be later on down the road in the next semester. And then finally, stage 4 is going to happen in the 20th century. Usually around World War I is where it kind of begins, but it's going to last all the way through the 1960s and the 1970s. And it's a period where basically Africa and Asia are all going to, especially Africa, are all going to overthrow their European rulers after World War II. And it's an era that's called decolonization. And there's going to be bloody wars of resistance and massacres throughout this time period. And guys, that is another staple of imperialism in every stage: massacres and death. Now, there's more to imperialism than that. We'll talk about it a little bit later. We're going to, later on when we get to the new imperialism, we're going to talk about what are the costs and benefits of imperialism. Okay? But that is another side effect, guys, is massacres and war. All right, pause if you need to, and let's move on. Mercantile empires. So if you remember the essential question that I did not write down, but this is the essential question, what are the characteristics of mercantile empires? That was our essential question, and now we're going to kind of answer that. So the very first thing I want to talk about are the goals of mercantilism, okay? Now remember, in a mercantilist empire, you've got a mother country, that is usually the European powerful country, and you've got what's called the colony. So one of the goals of mercantilism is this. The mother country made colonies for one reason, to provide them with goods and natural resources that they really can't get in their home country. If you think about it, Great Britain is a tiny island compared to all the 13 colonies of the Americas. The 13 colonies of the Americas have so many natural resources and such a variety and an abundance, far more than they would ever have in Great Britain. So Great Britain sets up these colonies and they benefit from the colonies. So never forget, the goal of mercantilism is to benefit the mother country. Now, what happens is mother countries, if you look at this diagram on the right, they take natural resources from the colonies. For instance, look at the diagram. Gold, silver, animal fur. That's going to be a big one that Great Britain and the French are going to want from the Americas. Lumber, foodstuffs like corn and beans and squash and later on other things. And what they're going to do is the colonies send this stuff to the mother country. And then the mother country, with their early pre-industrial factories and then later on factories, are going to take these raw goods and make stuff out of it. For instance, lumber. They're going to take the lumber from the American colonies and they're going to build British ships for their navy out of that. And then the idea is you sell finished goods back to the colonies. So the colonies send more natural resources and goods, and the mother country manufactures things out of the natural resources and sells them back to the colonies, and around we go for all eternity. But once again, who benefits the most out of this? The mother country. Now, I wanted to define a couple things. The very first thing I want to define is imports. Every country, even today, guys, we have imports. Imports are commodities. Now, you might be like, well, hon, what's a commodity? That's a big word. It just means goods or resources or services, okay? So imports are commodities that are bought from other nations. For instance, we buy in this country so many things from China. China, guys, sells us things and we buy from them. Those are called imports, imported from China. If you turn around and look at the tag on your shirt, it's probably made in Thailand or made in Honduras or somewhere like that. Those are all imports. Now, the next thing are exports. Exports are commodities that are sold to other nations. If you want to think of it this way, import, you're bringing things into your country by buying them. Export, things are exiting your country because you're selling them. Imports, exports. Now, the more you export, the better off your country is because you are making money. So another goal of mercantilism is to gain wealth by exporting or selling more than you import. It says important, but it's supposed to say more than you import. Like I said, it's kind of like having a budget. When you have a budget, you want to make more money than you spend, right? So that's the goal of mercantilism. Pause if you need to. All right, now, problems with mercantilism. Obviously, in a system like this, there's going to be some problems. Well, number one, sometimes the colonies are more economically powerful than the mother country. And they kind of realize, why on earth are we sending all these raw materials to the mother country so they can manufacture things when we have the means to manufacture things here and build our own stuff? Why do we even need the mother country? Now, when colonies start thinking like this, ooh, that's dangerous for the mother country. Colonies that begin thinking like this are Brazil, which is a colony of Portugal. And then later on, of course, the good old United States is going to start to think, do we even really need Great Britain? But another problem with mercantilism is that mother countries held monopolies, supposed to be highlighted yellow, monopolies over colonial trade. Now, you might be like, what is a monopoly? I've played that game before. Well, guys, a monopoly is when you control the resources of one particular resource or the resources of an area. Monopoly means you have absolute control. Imagine, guys, if I controlled all the gas stations where we live. I would make a lot of money, right? Because I would have a monopoly over the gas stations. That means, guys, I could raise the price of gas to whatever I wanted, and none of you guys could do anything about it because I'm the closest gas station, right? That's what a monopoly is. It's also why when you play the game Monopoly and you collect all three of the same color, you have a monopoly, which means you control all of that. And what happens to the prices of everything on your properties that you rent? It goes up. Wow, it all works together, doesn't it? So, one of the problems with mercantilism is that mother countries have a monopoly on all the trade. And colonies have to sell to the mother country. They're not allowed to sell to other countries. People like the American colonies start thinking, I could make a lot more money if I sold to France instead of Great Britain. But I'm not allowed to do that. So you know what colonies start doing? They start smuggling, which means selling things behind the mother country's back. And that's going to be a big problem. Now, there's a couple areas of conflict that we're going to talk about later on in this stage. And the first area is obviously the Americas. Why? Well, look at this, guys. You've got the British that control the East Coast. You've got France that controls the middle part of what we would call the United States. And you've got Spain that controls what we would call Texas and Mexico. All of these three European powers are all in the same area, and they're all fighting for control of this land, and they're all fighting for control of the resources. So if you think that's not going to lead to a fight, you're wrong. That's going to lead to a big one. So French and British, and I guess Spanish even too, rivalry over control of sugar and other goods are going to happen in the Americas and the West Indies. Once again, the West Indies are these little islands down here where there's all these little islands that, for instance, France controls a lot of sugar plantations down there. So European nations are going to fight over natural resources, and they're going to go to big wars. Another area that we're not really going to talk about in this chapter, but we will later on, is India. British and French companies, East India companies, are going to fight for control of Asian trade. So another problem with mercantilism is because countries are so bent on making as much wealth as they can and they get it from colonies, boy, are they going to fight over these colonies. Well, guys, as you just saw, my computer's about to die, and that's the end of the notes. I'll see you tomorrow in class.